What's up guys, and welcome back to the Scale Model Shed YouTube channel. And today we're going to be building this Kinetic Aggressor F-18. But first I thought I'd quickly show you what the Scale Model Shed has become in the 18 months since I've been open. And most of you guys probably haven't seen the shop since I did my opening video back in May 2022. And as you can see, the shop continues to grow, so a massive thank you to all my customers both online and in person. None of this would be possible without you, and I'm looking forward to continuing to grow the shop into the future. Now I run the shop completely on my own, so unfortunately I haven't got the capacity to take orders from outside the UK. But undoubtedly this will be something that will be available in the future. You can check out the website at scalemodelshed.co.uk, and if you're down in the West Country, we'll be more than happy to see you. So apologies for throwing that into the beginning of the video, but there's a little update on Scale Model Shed. So now back to the F-18. This kit derives from the 2016 tooled Kinetic A-18C, and I found it went together very well with minimal fuss. I suppose the only thing I would say is that the rivet and panel line detail, although crisp, is quite shallow, making applying panel line washes slightly more challenging. It's been a while now since I posted the ME262, thanks for being patient, and I hope you enjoy the build. I use sprue goo, which is sprue melted in extra thin cement, to fill the gap in the headrest. I had some material left over from the bonnet straps on the Bugatti build, and I used this to make some pads for the pilot's seat. The seat is primed in black, and then detail is highlighted by dry brushing silver. The cockpit accommodates both single and two-seater aircraft. And again, the cockpit is primed in black, and anything that needs to remain black is masked off using masking fluid. I initially started to detail the control panels by hand, but then figured I'd get better results using the decals. Once dried, the decals really benefit from a coat of matte varnish. And then the screens are brightened up using some Microsol Crystal Clear. The main wheel wells are primed in white before being given a coat of satin varnish. And then detail is picked out using Mig Ammo's black and interiors panel line wash. The nose section glues together in two halves, and it's important to make sure that this is done perfectly in alignment, as there's a lot that can go wrong later down the line if it isn't. The air intake trim section didn't fit absolutely perfectly, but I glued it so it was spot on around the area that would be most visible, leaving any minor discrepancies in the areas that would be least visible. Once the nose section is glued into position, the inside areas of the cockpit are primed in black, and this black is used as the actual base colour. I don't see the necessity to airbrush a matte black over the top of a good black primer. It's worth noting there are two tabs located on the inside of the front wheel well, and I had to remove these in order to get the fuselage lining up perfectly with the front nose section. Once the upper and lower halves of the fuselage are glued together, there's a join line around the underside that needs filling. Whilst applying some Mr. Surfacer 500 to this filled join, you can notice some air bubbling back up into the airbrush cup while I'm spraying. If you get this issue, 9 times out of 10 it's either a bad or worn seal on your front nozzle, or as in this case, simply the front nozzle wasn't done up tight enough. There's a decent depth of frame around the front screen that's going to be painted, so I choose to glue it on with extra thin cement. So first I carefully remove some of the primer around the gluing surface. And this is the quickest and most secure way of gluing a canopy, but you have to be incredibly careful not to get the glue anywhere near the glass. And it's only an option if you're going to completely paint over the glued surface. Otherwise you're going to have to use a glue that doesn't damage clear parts, such as MIG Ultra or VMS Transperfix. Priming the area will give a good indication as to what it will look like in paint, and whether any preparation work is necessary. And for me that gap's too big, so I go ahead and fill and sand the area, being careful to avoid any panel line and rivet detail. Top tip, don't fit the pilot's seat. It makes it so much easier to mask the cockpit without it in. I use some soft packing foam to mask up any apertures before giving the model a wipe over with some isopropyl alcohol. This will remove any dirt or oils from the plastic before applying the primer. And I'm going to use a white primer, and this will keep the paintwork looking nice and bright, but also it will allow you guys to see what I'm doing, as spraying grey over the top of a grey primer is not very good for filming. And another reason white primer is useful is that I can apply it to the front wheel well, which has not yet been painted. Before painting, any rough areas of primer are gently smoothed off using a 4000 grade sanding cloth. I then take a relatively dark grey and mottle it over the whole model using an airbrush stencil. This is done to add some inconsistency to the tone of the final grey when we apply it. And this process is done pretty unmeticulously, as 95% of it's going to be covered up, and especially being that the Aggressor's white and black areas will take over large parts of the model. I then do the same thing with a slightly more bluey grey. I then thin the main grey colour with 75% thinners, and build up the layers on the model gradually until I've just got that mottling showing through. And now onto this Aggressor camouflage, and I'm going to do this manually using no mask sets because it's more fun. And this isn't a matter of spraying all the blacks and then spraying all the whites, as the black and the white overlap in different orders. So I start off by marking out the bottom layer black and whites. I also take note of any areas where the masking needs to be accurate, as the crossover works in conjunction with the decals. Another thing to bear in mind is that you've got these large front and back control surfaces that the pattern needs to flow onto. This blue tape is low adhesion masking tape from Mr. Hobby, and would be especially useful if you were spraying this camouflage scheme using acrylics. Acrylic paints don't adhere to the surface as well as lacquer paints do, and there's far more risk of acrylics pulling up off the surface when you demask. I'm using an off-white for the scheme, as I feel a full flat white would be too stark. And this C316 is a gloss paint, but that's not a problem, as any paint finish will be overridden by the final varnish layer. And for the other part of the camouflage, I'm going to use the Tamiya lacquer paint NATO Black. And it may appear that I'm spraying this black on a little bit sporadically, but I'm trying to ensure the final paint finish isn't too uniform. The black over the top of the white sections is easy, the white over the top of the black takes a little bit more time, building the white up in thin layers. Allow the white to dry between layers and finish as soon as you lose the black line you're trying to cover. Here the nose cone is painted in NATO black, whereas the anti-glare flash is painted in a true matte black. In some places I break up the camouflage with repair patches back to the grey base colour. I didn't go overboard masking everything off, as any overspray can easily be corrected. Once all the basic paintwork is done, this is all sealed in with a coat of gloss varnish. Once this gloss has dried, I then move to doing some post shading on some of the panel lines. And there's a reason I decided to do this after the gloss coat, and I'll come to that in a second. And this deep grey gives a great effect when sprayed across the light grey and the black. It's a bit like post shading and highlighting all in one. And the reason for me doing this after the gloss varnish is that if you go too far or you're not happy with the results, you can take some very fine sanding pad and carefully remove the work without damaging the paint underneath. And now moving on to the decals, they're first soaked in warm water for about a minute. Then microset is applied to the model and the decal is placed over the top. Microsol is then carefully applied to the top surface of the decal and it's left for a couple of minutes to soften. And as you can see here, the microsol has started to wrinkle the decal up. This means it's softened and it can easily be pressed into the rivet and panel line detail. A good tip here is to dampen the cotton bud or Q-tip in microsol, and this gives you firmer and much more controllable pressure on the decal. This blemish was caused by paint going down too heavily when I was modelling through the airbrush stencil. Now there's a gloss varnish over the top, I can easily remove the blemish with a 4000 finishing cloth. To create some extra interest in the model, I painted some of the panels in different shades of grey. And you'll see later in the video how I use this to help break up the camouflage on the control surfaces. Normally I would opt for a satin finish on modern jets, but looking at reference photos of the Aggressor aircraft, I opted for a full flat finish. And this varnish will override the appearance of gloss paint, the decals and any repairs, creating a unified flat appearance across the model. So the next job is to bring this thing to life, and for this I'm going to use oil paints. And basic rule of thumb is that I'm going to use smoke over the top of the grey, sepia over the top of the white, and a neutral grey over the top of the black. For their initial use as a panel line wash, these are heavily thinned using Abtielung's fast dry thinner. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, the panel lines are rather shallow on this kit, making it very difficult to simply apply the oil and then wipe the excess off the top, as doing this will also wipe the oils out of the panel lines and recesses. So clean thinners is first applied to the area, and then the oils are positioned and blended using a brush. Oils are a perfect medium for doing weathering, as even days after they've been applied, they can be reactivated and adjusted using thinners. Streaks can easily be created using a small amount of neat oil. You can blend neat oils to create shadows or highlights using a completely dry, clean brush. Here I'm using neat white oil paint to completely change the tone of one of the panels. As usual, there's a mould line we need to deal with down the centre of the canopy. The seam is first carefully scraped off using a new blade. I then use an ultra fine flexi pad set and polish the canopy starting with 1000 and working up to 10,000. And finally finish with Ultimate Products modelling polish. With the seam sorted, I can now mask and paint the canopy frame. The jet nozzles are first primed in black and then given a coat of gloss varnish. They are then painted using Ammo's A-stand pale burnt metal. The black enamel wash is left to dry before being carefully blended with a dry brush, being careful to allow it to remain in the recesses. Once dry, a coat of matte varnish seals it in. Moving on to the landing gear, and it's important to remove any seam lines from the struts. And these are given 2 coats of white primer and then a coat of satin varnish. Once the wheels are glued together, there's a gap around the tyre that needs filling. A flat is then cut into a section of the tyre. The wheels on this kit fit quite firmly onto nice chunky hubs on the landing gear. This means that they can be left loose and rotated so the flat sits firmly on the floor. After being painted in rubber black, pigment fixer and black pigment is applied to the tyre. And once dry, this gives a nice matte rubber effect. Looking at reference photos, the front tyres don't seem to compress under weight like the back tyres do, so these are left as they are. The drop tank is first painted in the same way as the main fuselage and then treated to similar oil weathering. Once this initial work is dry, the drop tank is sprayed with a matte varnish. This will allow me to introduce a second layer of oil blending without disturbing the first layer. The oil is then blended with a dry brush, and this process is easier on a matte surface. And this effect wouldn't be possible without the barrier matte varnish between the layers. Now coming towards the end, the delicate front and rear wing surfaces can be glued in place. And you can see here how I use these surfaces to break up the monotony of the camouflage pattern and introduce some variation in tones of greys. So that's it for this one, guys. As I said at the beginning of the video, you can check out the website at scalemodelsshed.co.uk. For updates on the shop, you can follow the Scale Model Shed Facebook page. And I'm Scale Model Shed Andy on Instagram. And I'll put links to all of these in the description below the video. Please give the video a like, and if you haven't already, it'd be great if you subscribe to the channel. And I promise this time not to leave it as long until my next video. So thank you so much for watching, happy modelling everyone, and see you next time.